Part 17. There was her old friend Sir Harry. "Dear Sir Harry," she said, going up to the fine old fellow, who had produced more bad pictures than any other two academicians in the whole of St. John's Wood. They were always of cattle, standing in sunset pools absorbing moisture, or signifying, for he had a certain range of gesture, by the raising of one foreleg and the toss of the antlers, the approach of the stranger. All his activities, dining out, racing, were founded on cattle standing absorbing moisture in sunset pools. "What are you laughing at?" she asked him, for Willie Titcomb and Sir Harry and Herbert Ainsty were all laughing. But no, Sir Harry could not tell Clarissa Dalloway, much though he liked her. Of her type he thought her perfect and threatened to paint her. No, he could not tell her his stories of the music hall stage. He chaffed her about her party. He missed his brandy. These circles, he said, were above him. But he liked her, respected her, in spite of her damnable, difficult, upper-class refinement, which made it impossible to ask Clarissa Dalloway to sit on his knee. And up came that wandering will-o'-the-wisp, that vagueless phosphorescence, old Mrs. Hilberry, stretching her hands to the blaze of his laughter, about the Duke and the lady, which, as she heard it across the room, seemed to reassure her on a point which sometimes bothered her if she woke early in the morning and did not like to call her maid for a cup of tea, how it is certain we must die. "They won't tell us their stories," said Clarissa. "Dear Clarissa!" exclaimed Mrs. Hilberry. "She looked to-night," she said, "so like her mother as she first saw her walking in a garden in a grey hat." And really Clarissa's eyes filled with tears. Her mother walking in a garden! But alas, she must go. For there was Professor Brierly, who lectured on Milton, talking to little Jim Hutton, who was unable, even for a party like this, to compass both tie and waistcoat, or make his hair lie flat. And even at this distance they were quarrelling, she could see. For Professor Brierly was a very queer fish, with all those degrees, honours, lectureships between him and the scribblers. He suspected instantly an atmosphere not favourable to his queer compound, his prodigious learning and timidity, his wintry charm without cordiality, his innocence blent with snobbery. He quivered if made conscious by a lady's unkempt hair, a youth's boots, of an underworld, very creditable doubtless, of rebels, of ardent young people, of would-be geniuses, and intimated, with a little toss of the head, with a sniff, the value of moderation, of some slight training in the classics in order to appreciate Milton. Professor Brierly, Clarissa could see, wasn't hitting it off with little Jim Hutton, who wore red socks, his black being at the laundry. About Milton, she interrupted. She said she loved Bach. So did Hutton. That was the bond between them, and Hutton, a very bad poet, always felt that Mrs. Dalloway was far the best of the great ladies who took an interest in art. It was odd how strict she was. About music she was purely impersonal. She was rather a prig, but how charming to look at. She made her house so nice if it weren't for her professors. Clarissa had half a mind to snatch him off and set him down at the piano in the back room, for he played divinely. "But the noise," she said, "the noise!" "The sign of a successful party." Nodding urbanely, the professor stepped delicately off. "He knows everything in the whole world about Milton," said Clarissa. "Does he indeed?" said Hutton, who would imitate the professor throughout Hampstead, the professor on Milton, the professor on moderation, the professor stepping delicately off. "But she must speak to that couple," said Clarissa, "Lord Gayton and Nancy Blow." Not that they added perceptibly to the noise of the party. They were not talking, perceptibly as they stood side by the yellow curtains. They would soon be off elsewhere together, and never had very much to say in any circumstances. They looked, that was all. That was enough. They looked so clean, so sound, she with an apricot bloom of powder and paint, but he scrubbed, rinsed, with the eyes of a bird, so that no ball could pass him or stroke surprise him. He struck, he leapt accurately on the spot. Ponies' mouths quivered at the end of his reins. He had his honours, ancestral monuments, banners hanging in the church at home. He had his duties, his tenants, a mother and sisters, had been all day at Lord's, and that was what they were talking about. Cricket, cousins, the movies, when Mrs. Dalloway came up. Lord Gayton liked her most awfully, so did Miss Blow. She had such charming manners. "It is angelic, it is delicious of you to have come," she said. She loved Lord's, she loved youth, and Nancy, dressed at enormous expense by the greatest artists in Paris, stood there looking as if her body had merely put forth, of its own accord, a green frill. "I had meant to have dancing," said Clarissa. For the young people could not talk, and why should they? Shout, embrace, swing, be up at dawn, carry sugar to ponies, kiss and caress the snouts of adorable chows, and then, all tingling and streaming, plunge and swim. But the enormous resources of the English language, the power it bestows, after all, of communicating feelings, at their age she and Peter would have been arguing all the evening, was not for them. They would solidify young. They would be good beyond measure to the people on the estate, but alone, perhaps, rather dull. "What a pity," she said. "I had hoped to have dancing. It was so extraordinarily nice of them to have come, but talk of dancing, the rooms were packed." There was old Aunt Helena in her shawl. Alas, she must leave them, Lord Gayton and Nancy Blow. There was old Miss Perry, her aunt. For Miss Helena Perry was not dead. Miss Perry was alive. She was past 80. She ascended staircases slowly with a stick. She was placed in a chair. Richard had seen to it. People who had known Burma in the 70s were always led up to her. Where had Peter got to? They used to be such friends. For at the mention of India or even Ceylon, her eyes, only one was glass, slowly deepened, became blue, beheld not human beings. She had no tender memories, no proud illusions about viceroys, generals, mutinies. It was orchids she saw, and mountain passes, and herself carried on the backs of coolies in the 60s over solitary peaks, or descending to uproot orchids, startling blossoms never beheld before, which she painted in water-colour, an indomitable Englishwoman, fretful if disturbed by the war, say, which dropped a bomb at her very door, from her deep meditation over orchids and her own figure journeying in the 60s in India. But here was Peter. "Come and talk to Aunt Helena about Burma," said Clarissa. And yet he had not had a word with her all the evening. "We will talk later," said Clarissa, leading him up to Aunt Helena in her white shawl with her stick. "Peter Walsh," said Clarissa. That meant nothing. Clarissa had asked her. It was tiring, it was noisy, but Clarissa had asked her, so she had come. It was a pity that they lived in London, Richard and Clarissa. If only for Clarissa's health it would have been better to live in the country, but Clarissa had always been fond of society. "He has been in Burma," said Clarissa. Ah, she could not resist recalling what Charles Darwin had said about her little book on the orchids of Burma. Clarissa must speak to Lady Bruton. No doubt it was forgotten now, her book on the orchids of Burma, but it went into 3 editions before 1870, she told Peter. She remembered him now. He had been at Bourton, and he had left her, Peter Walsh remembered, without a word in the drawing-room that night when Clarissa had asked him to come boating. Richard so much enjoyed his lunch party, said Clarissa to Lady Bruton. Richard was the greatest possible help, Lady Bruton replied. He helped me to write a letter. And how are you? Oh, perfectly well, said Clarissa. Lady Bruton detested illness in the wives of politicians. And there's Peter Walsh, said Lady Bruton, for she could never think of anything to say to Clarissa, though she liked her. She had lots of fine qualities, but they had nothing in common, she and Clarissa. It might have been better if Richard had married a woman with less charm, who would have helped him more in his work. He had lost his chance of the cabinet. There's Peter Walsh, she said, shaking hands with that agreeable sinner, that very able fellow who should have made a name for himself but hadn't, always in difficulties with women, and, of course, old Miss Perry, wonderful old lady. Lady Bruton stood by Miss Perry's chair, a spectral grenadier, draped in black, inviting Peter Walsh to lunch. Cordial, but without small talk, remembering nothing whatever about the flora or fauna of India. She had been there, of course, had stayed with 3 viceroys, thought some of the Indian civilians uncommonly fine fellows. But what a tragedy it was, the state of India! The Prime Minister had just been telling her. Old Miss Perry, huddled up in her shawl, did not care what the Prime Minister had just been telling her, and Lady Bruton would like to have Peter Walsh's opinion, he being fresh from the centre, and she would get Sir Sampson to meet him, for really it prevented her from sleeping at night. The folly of it, the wickedness, she might say, being a soldier's daughter. She was an old woman now, not good for much, but her house, her servants, her good friend Milly Brush, did he remember her? Were all there only asking to be used, if they could be of help, in short. For she never spoke of England, but this Isle of Men, this dear, dear land, was in her blood, without reading Shakespeare, and if ever a woman could have worn the helmet and shot the arrow, could have led troops to attack, ruled with indomitable justice barbarian hordes, and lain under a shield noseless in a church, or made a grass-green mound on some primeval hillside, that woman was Millicent Bruton. Debarred by her sex, and some truancy, too, of the logical faculty, she found it impossible to write a letter to the Times. She had the thought of empire always at hand, and had acquired from her association with that armoured goddess her ramrod bearing, her robustness of demeanour, so that one could not figure her even in death parted from the earth, or roaming territories over which, in some spiritual shape, the Union Jack had ceased to fly. To not be English even among the dead! No, no, impossible! But was it Lady Bruton whom she used to know? Was it Peter Walsh grown grey? Lady Rossiter asked herself, who had been Sally Seton. It was old Miss Perry, certainly, the old aunt who used to be so cross when she stayed at Bourton. Never should she forget running along the passage naked, and being sent for by Miss Perry. And Clarissa, oh, Clarissa! Sally caught her by the arm. Clarissa stopped beside them. "But I can't stay," she said. "I shall come later." "Wait," she said, looking at Peter and Sally. They must wait, she meant, until all these people had gone. "I shall come back," she said, looking at her old friends, Sally and Peter, who were shaking hands, and Sally, remembering the past, no doubt, was laughing. But her voice was wrung of its old ravishing richness, her eyes not aglow as they used to be when she smoked cigars, when she ran down the passage to fetch her sponge bag without a stitch of clothing on her, and Ellen Atkins asked, what if the gentleman had met her? But everybody forgave her. She stole a chicken from the larder because she was hungry in the night. She smoked cigars in her bedroom. She left a priceless book in the punt. But everybody adored her, except perhaps Papa. It was her warmth, her vitality. She would paint, she would write. Old women in the village never to this day forgot to ask after "your friend in the red cloak who seemed so bright." She accused Hugh Whitbread, of all people, and there he was, her old friend Hugh, talking to the Portuguese ambassador, of kissing her in the smoking room to punish her for saying that women should have votes. Vulgar men did, she said, and Clarissa remembered having to persuade her not to denounce him at family prayers, which she was capable of doing with her daring, her recklessness, her melodramatic love of being the centre of everything and creating scenes, and it was bound, Clarissa used to think, to end in some awful tragedy, her death, her martyrdom, instead of which she had married, quite unexpectedly, a bald man with a large buttonhole who owned, it was said, cotton mills at Manchester, and she had 5 boys. She and Peter had settled down together. They were talking. It seemed so familiar that they should be talking. They would discuss the past. With the two of them, even more than with Richard, she shared her past, the garden, the trees, old Joseph Brightcoft singing Brahms without any voice, the drawing-room wallpaper, the smell of the mats. A part of this Sally must always be, Peter must always be. But she must leave them. There were the Bradshaws, whom she disliked. She must go up to Lady Bradshaw, in grey and silver, balancing like a sea lion at the edge of its tank, barking for invitations, duchesses, the typical successful man's wife. She must go up to Lady Bradshaw and say... But Lady Bradshaw anticipated her. "We are shockingly late, dear Mrs. Dalloway. We hardly dared to come in," she said. And Sir William, who looked very distinguished with his grey hair and blue eyes, said yes, they had not been able to resist the temptation. He was talking to Richard about that bill, probably, which they wanted to get through the Commons. Why did the sight of him talking to Richard curl her up? He looked what he was, a great doctor, a man absolutely at the head of his profession, very powerful, rather worn. For think what cases came before him, people in the uttermost depths of misery, people on the verge of insanity, husbands and wives. He had to decide questions of appalling difficulty. Yet what she felt was, one wouldn't like Sir William to see one unhappy. No, not that man. "How is your son at Eton?" she asked Lady Bradshaw. "He had just missed his 11," said Lady Bradshaw, "because of the mumps. His father minded even more than he did," she thought, being, she said, nothing but a great boy himself. Clarissa looked at Sir William, talking to Richard. He did not look like a boy, not in the least like a boy. She had once gone with someone to ask his advice. He had been perfectly right, extremely sensible. But, heavens, what a relief to get out to the street again! There was some poor wretch sobbing, she remembered, in the waiting-room, but she did not know what it was, about Sir William, what exactly she disliked. Only Richard agreed with her. Didn't like his taste, didn't like his smell. But he was extraordinarily able. They were talking about this bill. Some case, Sir William was mentioning, lowering his voice. It had its bearing upon what he was saying about the deferred effects of shell shock. There must be some provision in the bill. Sinking her voice, drawing Mrs. Dalloway into the shelter of a common femininity, a common pride in the illustrious qualities of husbands and their sad tendency to overwork, Lady Bradshaw, poor goose, one didn't dislike her, murmured how, just as we were starting, my husband was called up on the telephone, a very sad case, a young man That is what Sir William is telling Mr. Dalloway. Had killed himself. He had been in the army. Oh, thought Clarissa, in the middle of my party, here's death, she thought. She went on into the little room where the Prime Minister had gone with Lady Bruton. Perhaps there was somebody there, but there was nobody. The chairs still kept the impress of the Prime Minister and Lady Bruton, she turned deferentially, he sitting foursquare authoritatively. They had been talking about India. There was nobody. The party's splendour fell to the floor. So strange it was to come in alone in her finery. What business had the Bradshaws to talk of death at her party? A young man had killed himself, and they talk of it at her party. The Bradshaws talked of death. He had killed himself, but how? Always her body went through it first when she was told suddenly of an accident. Her dress flamed, her body burnt. He had thrown himself from a window. Up had flashed the ground. Through him, blundering, bruising, went the rusty spikes. There he lay with a thud, thud, thud in his brain, and then a suffocation of blackness. So she saw it. But why had he done it? And the Bradshaws talked of it at her party. She had once thrown a shilling into the Serpentine, never anything more. But he had flung it away. They went on living. She would have to go back. The rooms were still crowded. People kept on coming. All day she had been thinking of Borton, of Peter, of Sally. They would grow old. A thing there was that mattered. A thing, wreathed about with chatter, defaced, obscured in her own life, let drop every day in corruption, lies, chatter. This he had preserved. Death was defiance. Death was an attempt to communicate, people feeling the impossibility of reaching the centre which mystically evaded them. Closeness drew apart. Rapture faded. One was alone. There was an embrace in death. But this young man who had killed himself, had he plunged holding his treasure? If it were now to die, 'twere now to be most happy, she had said to herself once coming down in white. Oh, there were the poets and thinkers. Suppose he had had that passion, and had gone to Sir William Bradshaw, a great doctor, yet to her obscurely evil, without sex or lust, extremely polite to women, but capable of some indescribable outrage, forcing your soul, that was it. If this young man had gone to him, and Sir William had impressed him like that with his power, might he not then have said, indeed she felt it now, life is made intolerable. They make life intolerable, men like that. Then, she had felt it only this morning, there was the terror, the overwhelming incapacity, one's parents giving it into one's hands, this life to be lived to the end, to be walked with serenely. There was in the depths of her heart an awful fear. Even now, quite often, if Richard had not been there reading the Times, so that she could crouch like a bird and gradually revive, send roaring up that immeasurable delight, rubbing stick to stick, one thing with another, she must have perished. But that young man had killed himself.